Hello, welcome to part 2 of our lecture on classical act utilitarianism. In our first lecture, we went over the earliest form of utilitarianism, that created by Jeremy Bentham. And we also looked at Bentham's philosophic calculus, which gave us an idea of at least one way that some utilitarians may make decisions regarding what is a morally permissible act versus what is not a morally permissible act. To remind you, our theory in a nutshell thus far: an action is right if and only if it has a higher utility than any other alternative action that the agent could perform instead. And our theory of the good is going to involve the value whose utility is considered in the utilitarian calculus. Again, when we talk about act utilitarianism, that value is happiness or pleasure. Now, if we just consider happiness or pleasure, well, we have a problem. And that comes from what has been classically called the doctrine of swine objection. John Stuart Mill, who took from Jeremy Bentham's theory of utilitarianism and refined it quite a bit, discusses it in this way. Now, such a theory of life excites in many minds, and among them in some of the most estimable in feeling and purpose, inveterate dislike. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a swine only. Now, this objection zeroes in on the theory of the good and says, hey, if you're making your idea of happiness or pleasure the sole thing which is good in life, if this is the ultimate end, the ultimate good of life, then ultimately we get a theory of ethics here which doesn't make a difference. Again, I could be a pig wallowing in filth, be happy and as content as could be, and that doesn't seem to give me a good idea of how to base ethics. It seems like ethics should be more than that. Well, Mill seeks to answer this. Mill gives us a more refined idea of hedonism. Quantitative hedonism, or QH1 here, basically says that intensity and duration of pleasure can be measured in units. Now, this unit is not a discrete unit. It's not as though you can go to the store and say, hey, barkeep, I'd like to get 50 units of pleasure, please. It's not going to work quite work that way. So this idea of unitary pleasure, or a value that we associate with pleasure, is going to be something that's going to be more roundabout. It's not going to be something where we maybe give an exact number. Though for the purposes of, say, for example, Bentham's calculus, we're going to try to find some way to at least have some type of consistency between our units. Mill brings about the question of qualitative hedonism, or QH2. The quality of an act, in addition to its quantity, must be considered. Certain pleasures, such as those gained from intellectual or aesthetic pursuits, are of higher quality than biological pleasures. Mill is doing something remarkably interesting here. He's saying that there are certain actions that we engage in as humans which bring about a different kind of pleasure than, say, the pleasure that comes from exciting our senses. Say, for example, again, eating a piece of pie, or through sex, or something along those lines. Mill argues that these intellectual pursuits, or aesthetic pursuits, the pursuits that we may find from learning, from reading, from viewing art, for example, or producing art, these things are of a different type of pleasure, a different quality of pleasure than those base biological pleasures. So going deeper into it, we have the question here. If we accept hedonism as a theory of value, we see that two claims come out. Pleasure is intrinsically good, and certain properties possessed by states of pleasure make them intrinsically good. So let's consider this a little further. In Timmins, he discusses the example of Haydn and the oyster. This goes back to the question of quantitative versus qualitative hedonism. Remember, hedonism states that the intensity and duration of pleasure can be measured in units. The example of Haydn and the oyster asks us to consider, well, what happens if we're an immortal oyster? Probably being an oyster in the ocean, doing its oysterly kind of things, is going to provide a certain degree of pleasure to the oyster. But imagine that you could have the life of, say, Joseph Haydn. A musician who came into his own during his lifetime, who saw wide success, was lauded by both critical populations as well as populations of royalty and so forth, whose music lives on and inspires many people and many composers today, and since the time of his life. If we consider qualitative hedonism, it seems that that type of pleasure may be something more. So if we have the chance to be Haydn or the oyster in another life, being Haydn may be more worthwhile. Now there's an important question that comes up here. If we're going to say that there's a difference in terms of qualities of pleasure, we have to try to figure out how we're going to figure that out. By what means are we going to determine that, say, intellectual or aesthetic pleasures are of a higher quality than biological pleasures? According to Mill, we should convene a group of competent judges. And these are individuals who've experienced the full range of pleasures. Now, I don't know about you, but it sounds pretty cool to get on this panel, if you ask me. Well, according to Mill, he believes that if we bring about these judges and they converse about the different types of pleasures they've experienced, if they were to somehow give us some type of ranking of pleasures, they would tell us that the pleasures from higher faculties, again, aesthetic or intellectual pursuits, are more desirable and of higher quality than those of lower faculties. Again, biological or physiological pleasures. When we bring all this together, Mill says that we don't have a doctrine worthy of swine. If we just considered quantitative hedonism, then we might not have a good answer to this. But if we consider that pleasures are different in terms of types of pleasure, qualities of pleasure, then we may have a form of ethics here which is better than just that of pigs. We may have something that's worthy of human consideration. Now, this may sound pretty good overall, but there are several objections that we could see to qualitative hedonism. First off, we have to question, is this intelligible? The intrinsic nature of certain forms of pleasure confers a different value than other forms. This is a basic fact that they're arguing. But does this make it something that we can really consider? Is this something that we can really discern? This is a question that we will continue to ask. And then furthermore, and perhaps the more devastating objection, who are these judges and what do they judge? Their verdicts only give us evidence of pleasure, but don't define or create pleasure in itself. Additionally, it seems like these judges, when they come together to discuss these different forms of pleasure, come in with what we call an a priori consideration. That is, they come in with a consideration that they brought to the table at the beginning, before they even got into their deliberation. If that's the case, they may have come in with this conception that intellectual or aesthetic pleasures are more worthy. And if that's the case, then we have to ask, what happens to the logic here? The logic associated with this differentiation of pleasure appears to be circular. Now, Mill is a genius. His IQ, by today's standards, was estimated to be probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 197 or something like that. An incredibly intelligent man. Logic, however, unfortunately, as in his defense of utilitarianism, is not really his strong suit, shall we say. Not only do we see this problem here with circular logic, but we see additional problems with Mill's proof. Mill tries to give us a robust defense of utilitarianism. And he does this by trying to say that, hey, if we accept that the principle of utility is valid, that doing this net balancing of pleasure and pain is good, and we adopt that is true, that life should mean something about that, Mill gets us to a position where he has to show us that happiness is the only good that has intrinsic value. In order to do this, he has to establish three different conclusions. First off, that each person's happiness is intrinsically valuable for them, that the happiness of all is an intrinsic good, and that the happiness is the only intrinsic good. His final and ultimate conclusion. Let's take his argument in detail. Let's break it down. Premise 1. People desire their own happiness for its own sake. Premise 2. If something is desired for its own sake, then it is desirable. Thus, each person's own happiness is desirable for that person, and if something is desirable, then it is intrinsically good by definition. Thus, our first conclusion, one's own happiness is an intrinsic good for oneself. Well, initially, this seems okay. So let's move on to stage 2. If each person's own happiness is an intrinsic good for that person, then the general happiness is intrinsically good for the aggregate of persons. So again, if I take everybody who's pursuing their own happiness, and that's good for them, then it seems to make sense that, hey, if I bring together a group of people who are doing that, then general happiness is going to be good for all of them. Therefore, the general happiness is an intrinsic good for the aggregate of all people. Well, now let's burst Mill's bubble, so to speak. Mill's got some real problems here with logic. When we look at stage 1, we got a pretty major problem here. Desirable means able to be desired and worthy of being desired. And it looks like Mill conflates the two uses of the word. Whenever he says to us, again, going back to stage 1, that if something is desired for its own sake, then it is desirable, he forces us to ask whether or not he's discussing that it's able to be desired, or is it worthy of being desired? Is this a property of the thing, or is this a different kind of quality of the thing? These two things are ultimately different. The two terms are different. Excuse me, two meanings are. Therefore, he commits what we call the fallacy of equivocation. That is, he uses a term with multiple meanings, and he uses it in both senses to mean the same thing. Ultimately, this language is a problem here. When we go to stage 2, we see another major fallacy. Assuming that my happiness is good for me and your happiness is good for you, and these add up for everybody, brings us to what we call the fallacy of composition. Basically, it's an assumption that Mill is making that the properties of a part is also possessed by the whole itself. Now let's consider things such as, say, for example, cooking. If I cook various ingredients, those things change. And the property of an ingredient may change in the cooking process or to the final product. But I wouldn't say that the final product, for example, is good in itself, or that it has that quality. So let's consider, for example, that I'm cooking with, say, brandy, or cooking sherry, or cooking wine. Would I say that the final product is alcoholic? Ultimately, no, because we know that the alcohol is burned off. Mill ends up doing this with his fallacy of composition by arguing again that my happiness and your happiness, we take that and generalize it out, that it adds up that everybody benefits from the general happiness. Let's look at stage 3. In stage 3, Mill says that all other things besides happiness that are desired for themselves are really only desired as parts of the end of happiness. Therefore, happiness is the sole intrinsic good. Well, the proof in itself clearly has flaws. It seems, however, that we may still be able to get some idea about ethics that involves happiness, impartiality, and maximization, and that this may end up giving us a basis for maybe a robust ethical theory. But the way it's presented to us by Bentham and Mill has problems. First off, there are plenty of practical objections. Our first objection here. The principle of utility is not useful because we'd have to figure out the utilities of all available alternatives. This calculation seems to be above our powers. If I can't do this, then how is the principle useful for providing a decision-making procedure? It's applicability, which basically says that, hey, if I'm giving you something, it should be achievable. It should be something we should be able to use. Well, if our decision-making procedure here isn't usable, then the theory has significant and severe problems. What the utilitarian argues instead is that the general principle of utility gives us a moral criterion, but not necessarily a decision-making procedure. That is, it gives us something as good, bad, right, or wrong, but it doesn't necessarily give me a way of figuring out how I should act. This may be a clever sidestep, but it may be a problem as well. Let's think about the general principle of utility in two different ways. If we think about the actual consequence versus the probable consequence, we'll see that there's a pretty major difference here. An action is right if and only if it has as high an actual utility as any alternative action that an agent could perform instead, versus an action is right if and only if it has as high an expected utility as any alternative action that the agent could perform instead. Now notice something particularly important here. When I discuss actual utility, I'm actually kind of looking at an action after the fact. That is, I'm looking at what the real consequences, real life consequences were of that action. If I look at probable consequences, I'm kind of taking my consideration to the stage where I look before I actually act. Now, how does this make a difference? Well, it ends up making a pretty big difference. Let's look at this example. Let's imagine that we're playing a game where rolling a six-sided die costs $1 to play. If you roll a 3 or a 4, you get $12. Otherwise, you get nothing. Now, we know that when we roll a six-sided die, that each outcome has a 1 in 6 chance of happening. So if we look at the expected utility, the outcome of rolling a 3 nets me $2. That is a 1/6 of possibly $12. The outcome of rolling the 4 also nets me this. The cost of playing is only $1, therefore the expected utility is $3. But if we look at the actual utility, hey, if I win, I'm a big winner. I just made $11. Otherwise, I lost $1. That's a pretty big difference. Let's look at some other problems. Well, we can more easily apply probable cause utilitarianism. Adopting it, however, could lead us to some pretty absurd results. So, for example, I may perform an act that looked good but resulted in catastrophe. Let's consider, for example, that, well, actually, we'll have an example here in a moment. We'll come back to it. Furthermore, if I adopt an actual consequence utilitarianism as moral criteria and probable consequence utilitarianism as a decision-making procedure, this seems to cause conflict with evaluating my actions. So I may get actions that seem right, but that may not turn out to actually be right. I apologize for the flaw in this slide. There should be. So I may end up in a situation where I get conflicting answers. This means I need to consider something new. I need to consider what we call the objective right and wrong and the subjective right and wrong of an action. Well, this is pretty important. The objective right and wrong of an action is determined by the actual consequences, and the subjective right and wrong is determined by the expected utility. So, for example, let's say that I choose to bring a cake to class. I made this cake. It's the best ever. I think I'll use the best batter and icing. But it turns out that 95% of the class is allergic to it. Do you blame me for baking and bringing the cake? Well, if I look at this example, objectively, it looks like I'm wrong. The actual consequences of this led to a lot of people in pain. Subjectively, however, I expected that the cake would go over well, be a smashing success, would be well reflected on my professor evaluations at the end of the semester when people say, hey, he brought yummy cake. Well, the cake may have been a lie if everybody got sick. This leads us to considering maybe a two-level approach to utilitarianism. In some situations, our time for deliberating is limited by significant facts about that situation. Imagine, for example, that I'm trying. Now, I may have to consider a lot of different actions in doing so. If I was to go through the calculus and try to consider the utilities of competing actions, it may end up with disaster with a dead child. What Mill will argue instead is that we're guided in most decisions by moral rules that we learn very early in life. And that these rules exist because we've learned to maximize happiness. So, for example, the rule that says, don't lie, or be honest, whichever version of that we take, may end up being a rule that just over generations, experience has taught us as humans that this serves to maximize happiness. If we adopt these moral rules, these rules of thumb, as they are, it shows that the principle of utility may still be useful in considering conflicts between moral rules. Furthermore, we may be able to argue that this first level moral thinking is intuitive and learned early in life. Our most basic moral teachings, the things that we learn from fables, the things that we learn from our parents as children, and so forth, comes from this level. But our second level moral thinking involves us critically deciding between conflicting rules, and this is where we may be able to utilize the theory. This is where we may be able to step in and say, hey, utilitarianism works.